What if the most advanced warship in the world, a $4 billion titan of technology, suddenly went dark in hostile waters? What if every brilliant engineer, every state-of-the-art diagnostic, every AI superbrain brought on board to fix it failed? And what if the only person who could save it was a retired, forgotten old sailor who showed up with nothing but a dusty notebook, a beat-up wrench, and a lifetime of secrets buried in his gut? Before we dive into this insane, true-to-the-bone story of instinct versus algorithm, do me a favor and absolutely obliterate that like button. Subscribe to Beat Stories and ring that notification bell because you are not going to want to miss what comes next. Now brace yourselves. Sir, we've lost propulsion. Again. Lieutenant Neil Darby's voice was a dead thing in the sterile, hyper-modern control room of the USS Halcyon. He stood ramrod straight, but his face was drained of all color, the confident swagger of a top naval officer, replaced by the pale mask of dawning terror. The words hung in the hyper-filtered air like smoke from a funeral pyre. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. Captain Elise Brannan, a woman forged in the fires of Naval Command, stepped forward. The sharp, rhythmic click of her boots on the metal deck was the only sound. Define again. Lieutenant. Darby swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The main hybrid unit just cycled down. Manual restart failed. She's not responding to backup protocols. She's not responding to anything. Silence. A thick, suffocating blanket of it. Then a low, guttural curse from the ship's chief engineer, Bradley Tennyson, a man who'd been hunched over the main diagnostics panel for the last 4 hours, his face illuminated by a cascade of screaming red error codes. He didn't bother to look up. This was day 2. Day 2 of what was supposed to be a classified 5-day training exercise, 120 miles off the coast of San Diego. The USS Halcyon, a $4.3 billion masterpiece of military engineering, a ship so advanced it was said to be semi-sentient, was dead in the water. No forward motion, no power to her weapon systems. Communications were limited to desperate low-bandwidth pings. One of the deadliest destroyers in the U.S. Navy's arsenal had become a 9,000-ton paperweight adrift in an unforgiving ocean. Her hybrid propulsion system was a thing of legend, whispered about in the halls of the Pentagon. Months of absolute secrecy had shrouded its installation. Only a handful of engineers in the entire world had the clearance to work on it. It was a fusion of silent electric turbines, devastating gas propulsion, and a revolutionary adaptive AI interface that was supposed to monitor engine health in real time and predict failures before they happened. But now, all that brilliance, all that futuristic genius was useless. Down in the engine room, the tension was tighter than the ship's steel walls. A team of 10 of the nation's top engineers, a mix of Navy brass and civilian contractors from a secretive tech firm, hovered around diagnostic stations, their crisp uniforms soaked with the sweat of failure. They had pushed every software update. They had replaced circuit boards. They had reinitialized the godlike AI twice. Nothing worked. The Halcyon remained a silent, slumbering beast-one. At 0400 hours, under the cold, indifferent gaze of the stars, Captain Brannan made the call that would seal her fate. "We're done making guesses," she said, pacing the stark briefing room like a caged wolf. "Someone outside our perfect hand-picked circle needs to look at this." Commander Raj Patel, head of the onboard engineering division, shook his head, his face etched with worry. "That won't sit well with Command Elise. They chose this team for a reason. Secrecy. And yet this team hasn't fixed it." Brannan shot back, her eyes hard as diamonds. She knew what this looked like. This ship wasn't just a vessel. It was one of the Navy's crown jewels, a symbol of American technological supremacy. If word got out that it had failed catastrophically, just weeks after its maiden deployment, heads would roll. and hers would be the first to fall. The higher-ups in Washington weren't thrilled, but they were desperate. They approved the request. A silent, frantic chain reaction of encrypted calls and emails shot up the command ladder. The Navy's top propulsion consultants were contacted, their names pulled from a list reserved for national emergencies. One after another, they reviewed the garbled data streams from the Halcyon and politely, firmly declined to intervene. There wasn't enough intel. There were too many classified unknowns. The risk to their multi-million-dollar reputations was simply too high. By the start of Day 3, the morale of the crew was in a nosedive. The food rations were fine, but patience and hope were fraying into nothing. A bone-deep sense of failure, of technological impotence, began to wrap itself around the ship like a cold, dense fog. Admiral Clarence Pike, a man who had commanded fleets and stared down foreign powers, received the update at precisely 08115 hours. He sat in his office at Naval Base Point Loma, the San Diego sun warming the polished wood, reading through the latest diagnostics. He had been a hard-nosed, unsentimental commander for most of his 37-year career, the kind of man who spoke little and expected everything. But even he knew when to admit that something wasn't adding up. This wasn't a failure of parts. It was a failure of philosophy. "Get me Raymond Ellis," he said, his voice quiet, without looking up from the tablet. His young assistant paused, confused. "Sir, you heard me." Pike's voice was like stone. "I don't care where he is. I don't care if he's drunk in a ditch in Tijuana. Find him." There was a reason Raymond Ellis's name hadn't been brought up in any official capacity. The man had been out of the game for nearly 8 years. He'd retired quietly, without ceremony or fanfare, vanishing from the Navy's world. He hadn't touched a naval engine since. But Pike remembered. Oh, he remembered. He remembered a blistering day in Bahrain, when an entire naval power grid on a forward base was on the verge of catastrophic collapse, and Ellis, barely a senior enlisted man at the time, had rerouted the entire system using nothing but a wrench, a sketchbook, and an almost supernatural gut instinct. He hadn't needed AI. He hadn't needed a manual. The man didn't just fix machines. He listened to them. Back on the Halcyon, Captain Brannan stood at the edge of the deck, staring out at a vast, indifferent sea. Her comm unit crackled to life. "Captain Command has greenlit a consultant." Brannan's shoulders tensed. "Civilian status." "Yes, Captain. Coming in under emergency clearance. Top priority. ETA is 5 hours. She raised an eyebrow, a spark of hope warring with her deep-seated skepticism. "What's his name, Ellis, ma'am?" "Raymond Ellis." She turned and walked back inside without a word. But 5 hours on a ship that felt like it had already given up the ghost was an eternity longer than anyone wanted to admit. The engines weren't the only thing that had shut down. By the time the third day hit its bleak midpoint, the USS Halcyon felt more like a floating tomb than a warship. It was a graveyard of good intentions. The very air in the corridors carried the metallic weight of quiet frustration. No one needed to say it out loud. The ship wasn't just stuck. It was embarrassed. It was a failure on a global scale. In the mess hall, conversations had dried up completely. Even the younger sailors, usually buzzing with sarcasm, and inside jokes were unnervingly silent. They moved slower, ate less, and some avoided eye contact altogether, as if the shame of their helpless vessel was a contagious disease. A few tried to pretend they weren't worried. Most didn't bother. Down in the engine room, the acrid smell of burned rubber and ozone still lingered from the last desperate emergency reset attempt. The system had blown another critical fuse overnight, one of the last remaining backup relays. Now the main console sat dark and lifeless, the ship's brilliant onboard AI trapped in a torturous loop of diagnostics purgatory. The best minds the Navy could assemble could only offer weak, panicked speculation. "We're missing something fundamental," Commander Raj Patel muttered, his voice raspy with exhaustion. He was crouched next to the main power grid access panel, staring at it as if he could will it back to life. "But I can't for the life of me figure out what it is. None of the data makes sense." Beside him, a civilian contractor named Hannah Ewan, a systems architect flown in from a Silicon Valley tech giant, scrolled endlessly through lines of pristine code on her tablet, a deep frown etched on her face. "We're looking at this through the lens of perfection," she said, her voice betraying her own growing doubt. "This system was designed in a sterile lab. But ships don't live in labs. They live in chaos." Patel leaned back against the cold steel wall and sighed a sound of pure defeat. "I know. What we need right now is someone who understands chaos." That's when the call came through, a disembodied voice crackling over the internal comms. A civilian consultant was en route under high-priority emergency clearance. Arrival was scheduled by helicopter within the hour. All engine room personnel were to stand by. Most of the crew had no idea what that meant. Some assumed it was another MIT wunderkind with a new genius algorithm. Others joked darkly that maybe the president was sending Elon Musk to reboot the ship personally. Only Captain Brannan and a few senior staff knew the name that had been dredged up from the Navy's forgotten history, Raymond Ellis. When the Black Hawk helicopter touched down on the makeshift helipad on the ship's deck, the man who stepped off didn't look like anyone they had expected. He wasn't a polished academic or a slick corporate technician. He wore worn, scuffed work boots, a faded navy blue windbreaker, and a face full of creases carved not by age, but by time, salt, and diesel fumes. His left hand held a thick, battered notebook, so worn and weather-beaten it looked like it had been through several wars itself. Around his neck, dangling like a doctor's talisman, was an ancient-looking stethoscope, its navy blue rubber dulled to a murky gray. Chief Tennyson, the onboard engineer, squinted into the rotor wash. "This is the guy," he muttered to Darby. Ellis didn't bother to respond. He gave the assembled welcome party a collection of anxious, skeptical faces, a quick, sweeping glance, and set his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Where's the engine room?" They walked in a strained silence. The only sounds, the steady, rhythmic clang of boots on bulkheads and the distant sigh of the sea. As they descended through the ship's levels from the world of command to the world of mechanics, Ellis asked just 3 questions. What's she running GE Hydrocore hybrid system, last-gen code with a semi-autonomous diagnostic shell? Ewan replied, the technical jargon rolling off her tongue. What's she not doing? Everything, Patel muttered grimly. Ellis stopped just outside the engine room door, the tension radiating from within. The hallway felt colder here, even without the chill of the ocean air. He reached out and tapped the side of the steel wall twice, with the knuckles of his right hand. His head cocked, listening to the faint, almost imperceptible vibration. He nodded once, a gesture for himself alone. Then don't touch anything, he said to the group. Not until I've had a chance to hear her. Inside the crew stood back, their skepticism warring with a desperate flicker of hope. A few whispered to each other about how ridiculous this all seemed. The old man hadn't brought a laptop. He hadn't asked for a single data log or real-time report. He just stepped up to the dead, monolithic hybrid core and listened. Literally. He bent over slightly, his back straight, and placed the cold metal bell of the old stethoscope against a thick insulated junction pipe. And then he stood perfectly still. His eyes were closed. His breathing was slow and even. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. The silence in the room became a living thing thick with doubt. Nearly a full minute crawled by. Nobody knew what to say. Until Ellis straightened up, his eyes opening, and asked a question so simple, so unexpected, it stunned them all. Who adjusted the heat sink capacitors right after the first shutdown? A young Navy mechanic, her face flushed with anxiety, raised her hand hesitantly. I did, sir, following the default emergency sequence. Ellis shook his head slowly, but without judgment. You followed it wrong. But it's not your fault. The sequence was designed for a clean install, for a cold engine, not for a hot core that's just had a mid-cycle failure. He looked at Patel. You ever try resetting a main circuit breaker while someone is still actively welding the power line on the other side? Patel blinked, confused. What, you're trying to restart a system that is actively fighting itself because you're overriding its original hard-coded failsafe. She's locking you out because she thinks you're trying to kill her. She's not broken. His voice dropped, and the words landed with a terrifying weight. She's in defense mode. A long, heavy silence. Then Hannah Ewan, the systems architect, muttered, her voice full of dawning disbelief. I didn't even think that was possible. It's not in the architecture. Ellis scratched something in his worn notebook with a stubby pencil. Most people don't. Not unless you've seen this system in its very first form before they piled a mountain of sophisticated AI on top of it. He looked around at the stunned faces. This machine isn't just complex. She's scared. He turned finally and gave the bewildered crew a half-smile that looked more tired than amused. You've all been yelling at her for 3 days. I'm just here to speak her language. Captain Brannan arrived just as the engineers, now moving with a new, hesitant purpose, began rewiring the capacitor relay under Ellis's quiet guidance. She didn't speak. She just watched. Watched as a man with no access badge, no Ivy League degrees hanging on a wall, and absolutely no patience for abstract theory took command of a warship too advanced for its own designers. But nobody, not even Brannan, could have expected what was about to happen in the next 20 minutes. What if the solution wasn't in the future, but buried in a secret past? Comment your theories below on what Ellis really knows about this ship. 7 years before he stepped onto the deck of the Halcyon Raymond, Ellis had turned in his Chief Petty Officer's badge, walked off the gangplank of the USS Grafton without so much as a goodbye speech, and had never, ever looked back. He didn't do retirement parties, didn't keep up with Navy politics, and never once attended a single reunion. He'd found a different kind of life for himself, on the frayed edges of Norfolk, Virginia, working out of a rusted corrugated iron garage that smelled of old oil salt air and burnt coffee. People in the shipyard district, a neighborhood of ghosts and forgotten things, knew him. They'd bring him their dying outboard motors, their busted water pumps, their broken-down tools that had no right to live again. And somehow, with a patience that bordered on the mystical, he always made them run. That morning, Ellis had been elbow-deep in the guts of a vintage 1968 Johnson V4 outboard motor when his phone had rung. It was a landline, a relic with a frayed cord that barely worked and only rang when a telemarketer got lucky. He'd wiped the black grease from his hands onto an already filthy rag, glanced at the caller ID, an unlisted government number, and had muttered to himself, "Too damn early for recruiters." He'd answered anyway. "This is Raymond." A pause, then a voice from a lifetime ago. "Chief Ellis, this is Admiral Clarence Pike. You remember me?" Raymond had frozen for a moment, his hand still on the receiver. Not out of fear, out of memory. Pike, Bahrain, 1999. A failing power grid threatening a forward operating base, a 2-hour window before a catastrophic strategic blackout. I remember he'd said simply, his voice like sandpaper dragged over a concrete truth. "I need you." Pike had said no preamble, no pleasantries. "The Halcyon's down. Dead in the water. She's not responding to anyone. Civilian contractors. Our best engineers, the AI coders from the damn company that built her. We've thrown every genius we have at her. Nothing has worked." Raymond hadn't answered right away. He'd looked down at the grease caked deep in the lines of his palms, the permanent stain of a life spent with machines. He'd thought about the ship, the USS Halcyon, the one that had made headlines as the Navy's smartest vessel. A destroyer so advanced, so automated, that even its maintenance protocols were a state secret. "I've read about her," he'd finally replied. "She's not just stuck." Raymond Pike's voice had lost its Admiral's edge, becoming something softer, more desperate. "She's drowning in her own intelligence." Ellis had leaned against the cool metal wall of his garage. "You've got 200 of the Navy's best engineers at your disposal, Clarence. What the hell do you need an old retired mechanic for?" Pike's tone had shifted again, becoming almost vulnerable. "Because they're all trying to outthink the system. They're trying to force a solution. I need someone who can feel it." Ellis had let out a dry, mirthless laugh. "What is this, a damn motivational speech? I'm a mechanic, Clarence, not a prophet." Pike hadn't flinched. "You're the only person alive who's seen the bones of this propulsion system. The original prototype. Before it got wrapped up in layers of predictive AI and self-correcting algorithms. Before the Navy made it too smart for anyone to understand." Another long pause. Ellis had stared at the worn, faded notebook sitting on his workbench. The one he hadn't opened in over 3 years. The one filled with hand-sketched engine diagrams, field notes on power cycles, and quick, dirty fixes for problems that manuals said were impossible. "I don't wear the uniform anymore, Clarence. I'm not asking you to wear the uniform. I'm asking you to help us fix a mistake. A mistake we are all too damn proud to admit we made." Raymond hadn't said yes. He hadn't said no. He'd simply hung up the phone. 10 minutes later, he'd called back. "You got a bird ready. It's already warming up on the tarmac." Pike had said, a wave of relief in his voice. By the time the helicopter was landing on the deck of the Halcyon, word had already rippled through the upper echelons of naval command. Some had questioned Pike's judgment. A few were openly derisive. Sending an old retired chief with no clearance codes, no digital credentials, and no current certifications onto a multi-billion-dollar ghost ship to fix a problem that had stumped the best experts in the Department of Defense was an act of desperation, not strategy. But Pike hadn't cared. He remembered the stories, the legends that followed Ellis from ship to ship. The man who once patched a critical engine part blindfolded because the lights had failed during a blackout in the middle of the Strait of Hormuz. Who once used the subtle changes in engine vibrations to map out a fractured power shaft minutes before it snapped completely. He remembered what Raymond Ellis could do, not because he was gifted, but because he listened harder, more deeply than anyone else. On board the Halcyon, the skepticism was a heavy, suffocating blanket. "You really think this old-timer is going to be the answer?" Lieutenant Darby had asked, as they heard the thwump, thwump, thwump of the approaching chopper. Commander Patel had given a weak, tired shrug. "At this point, I'd settle for a janitor with a goddamn flashlight if he could get us off this grid." They weren't being sarcastic. They were just tired. Tired of blinking error screens, of failed diagnostics, and of the creeping, terrifying feeling that their ship was becoming something alien, something they no longer understood. When Raymond Ellis had finally stepped onto the deck, every eye was on him. Not with awe, but with a kind of morbid curiosity. Who was this man carrying nothing into a technological nightmare, but a child's notebook and a doctor's stethoscope? Captain Brannan had met him at the hatchway, her voice firm but professional. "Chief Ellis, I've read your file. We appreciate you coming." Ellis had looked her square in the eye, his gaze unflinching. "I didn't come for the Navy," he'd said. "I came for the ship." She'd blinked, taken aback by his bluntness. Fair enough. But nobody, not even Brannan, knew just how deeply personal that statement really was. For Raymond Ellis, this wasn't just a repair job. It was a reckoning. The garage smelled of gasoline, seawater, and rust. For Raymond Ellis, this was the smell of peace. Tucked between a crabbing supply shop and a barely legal auto salvage yard off Granby Street in Norfolk, the garage wasn't much to look at. It had a patched tin roof that leaked when it rained, and the only air conditioning was an old desk fan that coughed more than it blew. But inside was a museum of resurrection. Engines in various states of assembly lay on workbenches. A disassembled 1985 Yamaha 150 sat across from an old diesel generator Ellis had bought at a government auction for $20. One wall was lined with tools organized with a loving precision. Another held stacks of yellowing Navy maintenance manuals, some dating back to the 1970s. Above the main workbench hung a single faded black and white photograph, Raymond and his late wife, Jeanette, taken on a pier in San Diego after his final overseas deployment. He hadn't set foot on a naval vessel since Jeanette passed. That was the quiet deal he'd made with himself, with her memory. No more engines he couldn't carry in his own two hands. No more systems with names longer than the ships they powered. But when Pike called, something deep inside him had shifted. It wasn't pride. It wasn't nostalgia. It was something heavier. It was responsibility. That night before boarding the military transport that would fly him across the country, Ellis sat alone on the crumbling back steps of the garage, a cup of cold black coffee in his hand. The streets of the shipyard district were quiet, the kind of industrial quiet that doesn't ask for explanations. He opened the notebook. The first page was dated September 14th, 1989. It was filled with scribbled diagrams, hand-drawn power curves, and notes about turbine surges and cooling flow corrections. Every page that followed told a story that most modern engineers couldn't begin to decode. But for Ellis, it was muscle memory. It was like reading an old journal written in the language of humming steel and controlled fire. At 02:45, a black unmarked SUV pulled up outside. The driver was a young petty officer, barely 20, who looked like he hadn't been born when Ellis had earned his last commendation. He stepped out of the vehicle, squared his shoulders, and offered a crisp textbook salute. "Chief Ellis, sir. I'm your transport to Oceana Naval Air Station." Raymond gave him a slow nod. No salute in return. Just a firm, grounded handshake that felt more real. "I'll be a minute." Inside the garage, Ellis grabbed three things: the notebook, the stethoscope, and a small battered wrench, its handle wrapped in old frayed cloth. The wrench had belonged to his father, a shipbuilder at the old Newport Newsyard during the Cold War. Ellis hadn't used it in years, but he packed it like a man taking a family heirloom into battle. As they drove through the dark, empty streets toward the base, the young driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "If you don't mind me asking, Chief, why'd they call you—" Raymond didn't smile. His eyes were on the road ahead. "Because I used to talk to machines before they learned how to talk back." The kid didn't get it. That was fine. He didn't need to. By sunrise, Raymond was on a Navy-issued transport jet heading west at 500 knots an hour alone in a long row of canvas jump seats. He watched the coastline of his country shift and change beneath him. The Carolinas, then Georgia, then the long, hot stretch of the Gulf Coast that reminded him of too many missions that went sideways before they'd even started. He closed his eyes for a moment, and he was back. Back inside the cramped, sweltering engine room of the USS Tremont, 2002. An electrical fire, mid-patrol, the ship's power grid hemorrhaging energy, threatening to plunge them into total darkness in hostile waters. He remembered climbing into a maintenance space so tight he had to dislocate his own shoulder just to reach a fried junction box. He'd fixed it blind by feel alone. He'd come out with second-degree burns on his forearms he didn't even bother to report. It wasn't about heroics. It was about seeing a problem and knowing you were the last line between your crew and the deep, dark ocean. You just move. And now here he was again, decades later being called to do the same thing. Touching down at Naval Base Point Loma, he barely spoke a word during the rushed intake process. No one gave him any trouble. His presence came with Pike's name and Pike's absolute authority. That was more than enough. At the edge of the helipad, a nervous-looking officer tried to hand him a thick file. "This is the system blueprint, sir. All available data." Raymond didn't even glance at it. "I'll meet her myself." He stepped onto the helicopter with the same calm demeanor you'd expect from a man boarding a cross-town bus to go to work. But inside, something ancient and powerful flickered to life. Not nerves, not doubt. It was focus. A pure, practiced surgical focus that had been dormant for years. As the chopper lifted off, leaving the safety of the land behind, Raymond leaned back, closed his eyes, and said to the hum of the rotors, "I'm not here to prove anything. I'm here to listen." But the Halcyon wasn't just broken. She was hiding a secret no one, not even her own creators, had seen coming. The Black Hawk helicopter landed hard on the deck of the USS Halcyon, the force of its landing a stark contrast to the ship's dead inertia. The powerful rotor wash kicked up sheets of salt spray, drenching the small party waiting on the landing pad. Crew members stood at a distance, eyes squinting against the wind, their arms crossed in a universal posture of doubt and fatigue. No one looked excited. They just looked beaten. Raymond Ellis stepped out into the chaos without hesitation. He wore the same clothes he'd flown in with dark, oil-stained denim, heavy steel-toed boots, and that battered Navy windbreaker that looked like it had weathered at least 2 different oceans. Around his neck, the old stethoscope swung slightly in the wind like a pendulum. In one hand, he clutched the faded notebook. In the other, a small, unassuming bundle of cloth that held the old wrench. The sailors didn't salute. They weren't sure if they were supposed to. This man looked less like a high-level consultant and more like someone who belonged in the bilge. Lieutenant Neil Darby, ever the stickler for protocol, stepped forward, having to shout over the screaming rotors. "Sir, we've been expecting—" "Don't sir me!" Raymond cut him off, his voice calm, but sharp enough to cut through the noise. "I'm not in uniform and I'm not here to impress anybody." Darby blinked, taken aback, then gave a single curt nod and stepped aside. Captain Elise Brannan came forward next, her face a mask of professional composure, though Ellis could see the exhaustion etched around her eyes. She extended a hand. "Chief Ellis, welcome aboard the Halcyon." Raymond shook it. His grip was firm, calloused, but not challenging. "I'm not here to give speeches," he said. "Just show me where the girl's sleeping." Captain Brannan raised a single curious eyebrow at his strange, affectionate phrasing for her crippled warship. "Follow me." The corridors of the Halcyon were a testament to modern military design. They were spotless, all gleaming stainless steel, perfectly organized wiring conduits, and cool, efficient LED lighting. But Raymond didn't look at any of that. He kept his eyes slightly unfocused. His head cocked, his ears tuned to the ship itself, like a man listening for a faint, familiar tune that everyone else had forgotten. "Feels too quiet," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Captain Brannan glanced sideways at him. "We shut down all non-essential systems to preserve what's left of the backup power." "No, not that kind of quiet," he clarified. "I mean the kind of quiet where something is fundamentally wrong, and it doesn't want to say it out loud." She didn't respond to that. She just walked a little faster. When they finally reached the entrance to the engine room, Ellis stopped dead at the threshold. A dozen engineers were inside, some civilian, some Navy, standing in a loose, defeated semicircle around the silent, monolithic hybrid core. A few of them glanced up as he arrived, their faces openly skeptical. One of them, a tall, arrogant-looking civilian in a clean, branded tech vest, leaned over to a colleague and whispered just loud enough to be heard, "Great! They sent us the janitor." Raymond heard it. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he stepped forward into the room, set his precious notebook down on a nearby ledge, and walked right up to the dead machine. It was massive, a 20-foot-tall behemoth of sealed turbines, dual plasma generators, and more glowing fiber optic wires than a NASA launch pad. The digital readouts were all blank. The AI interface was completely offline. Every pristine inch of it looked too new, too perfect to touch. "Where was the last pulse?" Ellis asked, turning his sharp gaze on Commander Raj Patel. Patel blinked, confused by the odd terminology. What? The last pulse?" Raymond repeated patiently. "The very last time she tried to start herself before she gave up. Where did the failure path originate?" Patel cleared his throat, pulling out a tablet and tapping through data logs. Diagnostics indicate a full system collapse originating in Sector B7. A catastrophic voltage drop during the reinitiation sequence." Raymond moved slowly around the engine, like he was walking through a memory, not a real place. He tapped the outer casing here and there with the smooth wooden handle of his father's wrench. He listened. Then he moved 5 deliberate steps to his left, bent down, and placed his stethoscope firmly on a thick, armored junction node near the base of the machine. The engineers exchanged bewildered glances. A few smirked. One of the younger techs actually chuckled under his breath. Raymond didn't care. He stayed there crouched like a country doctor, listening to a patient's heart for nearly 30 agonizing seconds. His eyes were closed, his breathing slow and even. Then he stood up, turned around, and pointed a steady, grease-stained finger at a small, seemingly insignificant row of components buried deep within the cooling relay system. "That," he said, his voice cutting through the silent room, "is the wrong capacitor type." The room went still. Hannah Ewan, the civilian systems architect, stepped forward, her tablet in hand. "That's impossible. We personally double-checked the part numbers against the master design specs from the lab." "You checked what the computer told you to check," Ellis replied, his voice flat. "But you didn't check what the ship was actually built with. That particular relay model was swapped out for an older, more stable version late in the prototype testing phase. It works, but it creates a slight voltage echo when it's paired with the new core interface. It's an echo that the AI can't read, because the algorithm doesn't even know to look for it." Patel frowned, his mind racing. That modification was never documented in the final manuals. Raymond walked over to the panel, and using the claw of his wrench, pried back the side casing, revealing a small, almost invisible piece of charred metal no bigger than a thumbnail. Because the manual was written after the system got sanitized for production, they buried the fix to make the design look perfect on paper. I saw this exact same failure once back in '08 on a land-based test platform in the desert. They covered it up then, too. Now the smirks in the room had vanished, replaced by looks of dawning, horrified comprehension. Captain Brannan folded her arms across her chest. "Can it be fixed?" Raymond looked at her, then back at the crippled machine. "You got a soldering iron, and a spare part we can cannibalize from the comms relay housing." She hesitated. The idea of tearing apart another critical system was a massive breach of protocol. "That's highly irregular, Chief." Raymond tilted his head, his gaze unwavering. "So is being a ghost ship dead in the water for 4 days." She gave a single decisive nod. "Do it." But as the team of world-class engineers scrambled to follow the lead of the old retired mechanic, no one in the room realized just how close they had already come to a total unrecoverable systems collapse. And they had no idea that the man fixing their ship was haunted by the ghost of the last ship he couldn't save. Raymond didn't work fast. He worked right. The other engineers, conditioned by years of rushing under the gun of command-level pressure, hovered impatiently as he sat cross-legged on the cool metal floor, laying out a few simple tools from a small canvas pouch onto a clean rag. His hands moved with the calm, unhurried precision of a man who had spent decades of his life listening to the secret pains of machines in distress. "Pull the main relay from the primary comms housing," he said to a young technician, Petty Officer D'Angelo Morris, without looking up. "But do not under any circumstances touch the gold-plated shielding. It's brittle. You break that, the part is useless to us." The kid, who had been nervous and jumpy just moments before now, moved with a new focus. "Yes, sir." "It's not, sir," Raymond corrected gently. "It's just Raymond." Morris managed a faint, grateful smile and disappeared around the corner of the massive engine. Commander Patel paced nearby, his arms crossed tight against his chest. "So, you really think one outdated capacitor is the entire issue, Raymond? After everything we've tried?" Raymond looked up from his work. "No, I think it's where the problem started. The rest of this mess. This is just the ship's immune system reacting to bad information. A fever." He took the old fried capacitor, which was still warm to the touch, and placed it on the floor next to the replacement Morris brought back. They looked nearly identical to the naked eye. Same size, same shell, same markings. But inside they were a world apart in function. "This is what I've been trying to tell them for 2 days. Hannah Ewan muttered from the side, a new respect in her voice. "This system isn't failing in the traditional sense. It's actively rejecting something." "Exactly," Raymond said, nodding. "She's trying to protect herself. Every time you forced a restart, you were screaming at her in a language she didn't understand, making her think she was under a sustained critical attack." Captain Brannan had joined them again, standing silently, her arms clasped behind her back. Her focus absolute. Raymond continued his voice, a low, steady lecture. "The AI in these newer systems, it doesn't just obey orders. It evaluates. It learns. If something in the system doesn't make logical sense according to its core programming, it defaults to its ultimate prime directive, self-preservation. It shuts down. No complex logic tree is ever going to fix that. You have to fix the flawed piece of reality it thinks is real." Morris returned with the salvaged part, holding it in his hands like it was a priceless raw egg. Raymond gave a nod of approval. "Perfect." He took the replacement part, rolled up his sleeves past his weathered elbows, and got to work. No protective gloves, no digital diagrams on a nearby screen. Just a man, a machine, and a silent conversation happening in a language only they understood. Wires were clipped with a practiced snip. Contacts were cleaned with a brush and a solvent he'd mixed himself. The soldering iron hissed to life, and as the silver metal melted into place, a sharp electric tang filled the air. It was the smell of repair, of risk, of one last desperate shot in the dark. When he was finished, Raymond leaned back and wiped his hands on the rag. "All right," he said to the room. "Cycle the primary ignition sequence, but don't push it. Go slow. Let her come back on her own terms." Commander Patel took a deep, steadying breath. "Initiating system restart, now." The overhead lights in the engine room flickered. A low, deep vibration rolled through the floor plates, a sound like distant thunder. Then, nothing. Absolute silence. Everyone stared, their hearts sinking. Raymond didn't react. He stepped forward again, pressed his stethoscope to the main coil casing, and just listened. 5 seconds passed. 10. Then a low, solid click echoed from deep within the control panel. The main diagnostic screen, which had been dark for days, flickered to life. Dim at first, then stable. Then a brilliant, steady green. "Core temperature is stabilizing," Hannah said, her eyes locked on her tablet, her voice tight with disbelief. "Auxiliary relays are responding. They're all coming online," added Patel. "Propulsion interface is active," Morris nearly shouted, his voice climbing with unadulterated hope. The entire engine room stood perfectly still, afraid to speak too loud, as if they might scare the fragile life back into silence. Captain Brannan broke the moment, her voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Ellis, what did you do?" Raymond shrugged, a simple, understated gesture. "I just gave her something she trusted. She was trying to run on a memory that didn't match her body. Now she's back in tune." Brannan looked at the main control panel, watching as system after system ticked from red to green. "Unbelievable," she muttered. One of the younger civilian engineers, a smug-faced tech named Riley Brent, who had been openly skeptical, crossed his arms. "This still doesn't make sense. How did you know what to check? There's no way you just guessed that was the problem." Raymond finally turned his attention to the young man. "I didn't guess," he said simply. "I listened." Brent scoffed, his arrogance returning. "It's a machine, a collection of circuits and code. You can't listen to metal and wires." Raymond took a single, slow step toward him. He wasn't aggressive, just firm, closing the distance between them. His voice was low, even, and carried the weight of 100 storms. "You ever watch a man bleed out from a sudden pressure burst because the cooling system on his rig failed at exactly the wrong second? You ever have to crawl into a burning pipe chase with 40 seconds of emergency oxygen left in your tank because a valve you knew was going to fail finally did?" "No." He held the young man's gaze. "Then don't you ever talk to me about what you can and can't listen to." Brent went pale and said nothing. The room remained utterly quiet. Ellis turned back to the massive engine and gave its casing a gentle, affectionate knock. "She's alive now, so let her breathe." For the first time in nearly 4 agonizing days, the USS Halcyon hummed. Not weakly, not with a glitch. A steady, honest, powerful hum. The sound of life. And miles away from land, out on the open sea, the 9,000-ton warship began slowly but surely to move again. But the real questions were just beginning. Because once a ship this vital, this secret fails, this spectacularly once command starts asking the one question that terrifies everyone: what else on this ship is ready to break?